appreciate a good some Maragoni students. Really quickly, just so I can take a poll, how many here are from Latin America? And how many live in the US? Okay. Crazy week we've had here in the US, hasn't it? I'm not gonna talk politics, but we are gonna talk a little bit about really what's happening in 2025. And I'll share perspective from actually a document that was released today. But let me go into this really quick. That's my name, and I've been reporting and researching on trends for the better part of 25 years. How I got into this business was I kind of fell into it. I just happened to be a journalist writing about culture back in the late 90s, and the internet started happening, something that we take very much for granted today, and essentially it's led to my career now. So the better part of 25 years, I've been paying attention to consumer trends, especially what's happening on the streets, and we'll get into that a little bit. So the space that I work on is here in the middle. So if you think about the mainstream, how do you guys describe the mainstream? Mainstream to me is mass commercial brands, brands like H&M, big box stores, absolutely amazing brands. Under that you have the emerging brands. My job is to pull up the emerging brands and to show the mainstream emerging designers and talent. So this is the white space I work in. If I was to look at it from perspective of a C-suite, I kind of communicate between the streets and the boardroom, if that makes sense. So I'm very good at talking to talent and making them understand what's happening when they begin to work with, say, corporations, as an example. I do the talking there. And then one more, which is something that I've been spending a lot more time on, especially in trend, is this idea between luxury and Amazon. And for the sake of this presentation, think of luxury as a category or marketplace, right? And then Amazon, we know, is an absolute marketplace. What is happening in the middle there? What is happening with the Shopify brands? What is happening with these Instagram-only or social-only brands? What's happening with small boutiques or small designers, for instance, in Latin America or in Europe, that may not necessarily have the attention that they deserve? A lot of my thinking is that there's space there to keep doing storytelling. And I think the most important one, which kind of speaks to streets and the boardroom, how many Gen X in the room? Oh my God, I cannot be the only Gen Xer in here. Wow. No way. How many early millennials? That means you're closer to Gen X. And how many late millennials? You're closer to Gen Z. And then Gen Z? We got no ways in the room. Okay, cool. So a lot of my work, because I am a Gen Xer, is in doing this translation. And today we'll talk about a trend that really hasn't gotten a lot of momentum yet, but it's the idea that this model is dead. And I'll explain what that means. Breaking people or consumers up by demographic may not be making as much sense as it used to. And I think there's gonna be some disruption around this in 2025. We got very lucky today that Business of Fashion and McKinsey released their State of Fashion 2025 report. Literally, they released it today. If we did this talk yesterday, we would not be talking about this report. This thing literally came out this morning, and it's kind of exceptional. And let me talk about the report because I think it's important. There are a lot of different companies that do trend-based reporting, that collect data, both anecdotal, and they put it together and they give you a perspective. Now, I've also been in media. I co-founded a property called Highsnobiety, and we also do trend reporting, and I'll show you some of the trends on that side as well. But the thing about State of Fashion is that they really talk to what's happening at, say, a strong sample of what the market looks like. So they're talking to luxury groups, they're talking to small brands, they're talking to boutiques, they are talking across the full pipeline of fashion. And every year they put out a report. And again, I don't know if it has to do with the election or the sentiment, but it's not necessarily looking that good. In fact, the big quote that I pulled from this was that the old playbook is now obsolete and the industry needs a new formula. Now, this is a workshop, so I want us to all kind of get involved. What does this mean to you? And how many have the same sentiment? So it's a pretty strong statement saying that nothing's working. And if you look at the actual 3 key points that came out of the study this morning, 80% of fashion executives expect no improvement in the global fashion industry. Is that the most depressing thing you've heard all day? Sustainability has fallen off of the agenda. And we're going to talk a lot about that in a second. With only 18% of fashion executives citing it as a top 3 risk for growth in 2025, down from 2024. And the final point is this idea of lack of consumer confidence, and more importantly, the appetite to spend. With 70% of them, right, that's 7 out of 10 executives are concerned about next year and what their sales look like. Let's go into some of what's working and what has not. And I'm going to leave this at these 3 points. The actual full study is coming out in 2 days, and it'll be interesting to see. But I want to talk about what's working, what's not working, and actually get you guys involved to get a sense of how it is for you as well. So I want to start with what we know. And again, a lot of this is going to be data. It's going to be anecdotal as well. And I'm pulling from what I would consider as trusted sources. This is people that are taking a sample group of a considered set and actually talking to a big service that can provide them with a background to give them a mass view of it as well. So when we look at the data, it's really been vetted. About 4 years ago, I worked on a report called Culture, Culture, Culture. We did it with Boston Consulting Group, again, essentially like a McKinsey or an Accenture, if you're familiar with these groups. And everybody was paying attention to 2025 as a big year. And what we discovered was that, and if you look at the data, 61% of the luxury market is going to be composed of you guys. That's massive. Why is that important? That tells us that a consumer set that is closer to my age or older than me is beginning to age out a little bit. Now, please take that with a grain of salt. Don't look at that very tight and specific. But the idea is that the spending power of millennials and Gen Z is certainly going up. And we can see those results today as well. Another key piece of data, is this consumer breakdown. And this is where we're still looking at demographics a little bit here. You can see that when we look at the general luxury consumer, I want you guys to look at the left column for a second. I'll talk about the other one in a second. This is currently what the breakdown looked like as of about 4 years ago, and it's really simply the same. You'll notice that it's pretty direct across it, but younger millennials, those that are aged closer to Gen X, actually are a bigger target for luxury spending and luxury space. When we look at desirability, and the way that I look at desirability and to think about this is, what are the key things, and I'll use it as a word things, but components of your business that are going to be expressed or emoted by a consumer? And again, we're looking at Gen X, and you notice that we've broken out older and newer millennials again. You'll notice that the black dots are showing what the desirability matrix for what consumers consider to be a luxury brand or a marker of luxury is. And you'll see, for instance, for Gen X, it's quality. If you came from my generation, quality was everything. When we think about luxury, what do we think about? We think about quality, we think about dollars, and we think about provenance or legacy. You'll notice, too, a big one being this younger millennial stage here, younger and older, where what's important to them is this idea of a status signal. Now, why would that be? Why is that different than Gen X? It's pretty clear. My generation did not have social media. My generation had photographs, and maybe somebody sent you a slide. We didn't have a way to express and communicate the way that we do today. And certainly as a consumer, there was really no way for us to let people know you had something unless you walked on the streets with it. And it had to be of quality. But today, the signal is very different. Now, here's where it gets really interesting, because we're looking at credibility. The idea that a brand has a certain level of trust or desire or emotion with the consumer. And you'll notice that for various things, millennials are paying a lot more attention than my generation did. And I think that's very obvious, right? We keep hearing this idea about sustainability, and sustainability being a table stake. By the way, like, somebody give me a definition of what sustainability is. Anybody have a definition of sustainability? Yeah, doing things better, leaving the earth better than we left it. Okay. Anybody, what's responsibility? Doing things responsibly. What does responsibility means? Understanding the cost, consequence, and risk of whatever you're doing, the desired outcome you want. And when we think about that, more than ever, my generation didn't necessarily think about, I mean, a certain amount did, but certainly a certain generation wasn't thinking about the environment or the impact. And what's crazy is if you look at that data from State of Fashion today, it's saying that more than ever, it's actually going down again, which is a little scary. And we're not really sure why. But if you look at what the important markers are for credibility by Gen Z, it's almost across the board having to do with an emotional connection. If it's not the timelessness of the brand, I actually will argue that. I think that luxury doesn't necessarily have to be based on time. You're 100 years here, I've been here 50. Is there really a difference? Today's consumer may not necessarily see that. That's why we see such a rise in, say, smaller premium brands that may not be considered luxury, but quite frankly are. You'll notice, too, that curation is important across the board. In fact, if you look at that report from State of Fashion, the one note that was interesting in it was that, one of the many notes that was interesting, was that more than ever, we're moving away from simply looking at an assortment of items all day long and swiping and swiping and swiping. How many of us are just tired of swiping? And eventually, you find a curated feed, which is exactly what you wanted, and you spend your whole day on there, right? So curation is more than ever important. The emotional connection to a brand. This will play a big part toward the latter end of this presentation. Emotional connection with a brand is very important. I mean, it seems like it's a no-brainer that it's important, but more than ever it is. In fact, if you look at data, and I don't have it here, the majority of Gen Z actually trust brands more than they trust politicians. They trust brands because there is a consequence for a brand, and there may not necessarily be a consequence for a politician. So trust has kind of moved there, though this last election would tell us completely different. So we'll see what the data says. Any questions on this? I think this is pretty obvious if it's your generation. It's important to know just where those differences lie. But again, the point I made earlier, more than ever, those black dots are kind of the same. Look at the first 2 and 3. Every generation. It's the same for everyone. And I will argue, in fact, I will predict that eventually this will actually just be a bunch of black dots where we're all thinking the same way. Again, that mindset versus demographic idea. Sorry, any questions on this? I can also provide a link to this report. It's a pretty robust report. And you notice that there was something about cultural pioneers earlier on the screen. I'm not going to get into that, but sort of a definition of the next level consumer. Okay, so what hasn't changed in 2025? Community matters. Anybody here run a community? Any community managers in the room? How many people interact with their followers or consumers directly, either through customer service or through Instagram DM? Anything? Okay. And go ahead, tell me about it. Do you interact with your consumers directly? You're hitting on something that I think should be obvious at this point. You can work with agencies to help you with social. Certainly, actually, the presentation prior to this was an amazing presentation because Facebook is an incredible platform for being able to really target audience. There's no doubt about it. But when you interact directly with your consumer, there's something else, and you can't necessarily put the faith in being able to have people speak your voice or language with agencies. I think this is why it's important to have people in-house. So the hard job for you will be how do you get and pass that knowledge on to the rest of your team, right? And I promise you, you'll figure it out eventually. But community manager, you have to keep talking and keep listening. I did a presentation last week with a former head of community from Twitter. He also headed men's street fashion rather for Instagram, and he mentioned how essentially you just have to keep talking. Human touch. Anybody here clienteling? You clientele now? Do you have a multi-brand store? Okay, great. And you interact one-to-one with your consumers all day? Got it. Anyone else? Anyone work for a multi-brand? Do you guys have a clienteling team, or do you guys do it, or you do it yourself? Tell me more. Being able to ensure that that human touch remains is important. I say that why? Because more than ever we have AI doing a lot of work for us. And you're not going to see much AI or me talk about much AI because it's there. You can use it as a tool, but there still is a difference between AI-generated content and real, trusted, human touch content. Social media matters. The one question that you hear all the time is, do I have to post on social media? Do I have to post every day on social media? Guys, the truth is yes, you do. If you have a consumer set that you're trying to reach, you got to put in the work. It's no different than them walking into your store, right? If they're walking into your physical, you're likely doing clienteling. You should be doing the same thing as well online. You need to have that personal touch as you communicate, or be able to build a team that has the same personal touch that you do, because that'll be quite important. Any questions on that? Yeah, the whole thing about like you still need the post. Anybody that tells you you don't have to post is full of shit. You still gotta be active. People need to see you. And I think this one's the important one. The generational gap is closing. How many have kids? I have 2. I have a 10, a 9-year-old, and a 6-year-old. How many of you guys listen to the same music as your kids? How many of your kids are listening to Drake and Kendrick Lamar? I mean, my kids are Miamians, so they listen to all that stuff. When I was growing up, I thought my parents' music sucked. I mean, as I got older, I should also mention, I am a first-generation American. Both of my parents emigrated from Portugal, to the United States in the 70s. And listen, I love fathers all day, but like when I was a kid, I hated that stuff, right? You kind of grow into it. I have a friend in Serbia who said the same thing. I hated this terrible music, but now all I want to do is sing it all day. Well, the truth is it's kind of the same way. Like that gap between my son, okay, he's my son. I have to take care of this boy. But it's crazy how closer we get with culture. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. And then one thing that got pulled out of the state of fashion that I didn't put earlier was this idea of new cohorts. How many people in this room believe that they understand who their consumer is? Come on, you gotta raise your hand. I do. Doesn't mean you're right. I mean, we all think we know who our consumer is, right? In fact, the gentleman that was speaking earlier from Meta, he was dead right. Sometimes the beast knows your consumer better than you. The closer you can get to understanding who your consumer is, and then more importantly, understanding where your new consumer will be or be coming from becomes important. Here's a very simple way of thinking about it. The term evergreen. Anybody heard of the term evergreen? It's used basically to describe a cohort that remains of a certain age at any time, right? When early days of Highsnobiety, we were younger, and we realized that we were getting older, but we always remained evergreen. We always kept focused on that young consumer that was coming to us. So every year, somebody was turning 18, 19, 20, 21 and aging out of it, right? On the other side, you can also just grow with your consumer in age. And I think that's what we're seeing more than ever. Now we can actually see that our consumers are like-minded, they're very similar to us, and more importantly, the spending power of the people around us, at least in my view, has gotten stronger. Now, all of this is anecdotal, but as soon as that report came out this morning, I was like, I have to talk to somebody big. I need to talk to a big multi-brand retailer. So who do I call? I call Essence. Everyone familiar with Essence in the United States? Who is not familiar with Essence? Essence is one of the bigger, let me stop there. They are one of the strongest storytelling multi-brand stores online, period. They do a great job of connecting. It's pronounced Essence, even though it's spelled Sense. So check out Essence if you haven't. And I really wanted to get some data to kind of like, I needed somebody to tell me if the data from State of Fashion was right. I'm very lucky that one of the people that came out of my office is Hayne Doran. She's an absolute incredible strategist. I stole her from GQ. I really did. I straight up stole her from GQ. And sometimes you gotta do it. Like if you see somebody you really like, and GQ's fine, they're gonna be okay. But Hayne is an incredible mind. And Hayne actually runs personal shopping at Essence. Now, in order to have a personal shopper at Essence, you need to be spending, what's the guess? $250,000 a year. So their top consumers are spending $250,000 annually with them. And we're not talking about 100 people. We're talking about a lot of people. So Hayne's insight into this is about as good as it gets. And this is not stuff that you're going to find anywhere. A lot of this is a little bit insider. So we were talking about, I asked her, I wanted to know, okay, look, we understand that the consumer trend is changing. It's aged down. Gucci, between the last 6 years, has been able to move the needle from a 60-year-old white woman down to a 49, 50-year-old consumer. That's a full generation drop for Gucci in order to reach a consumer. They did it. They were one of the first to do it, and everyone else is chasing. Now, on Essence, that personal shopper from the last few years has been a 21 to 30-year-old professional. How many people are here 21 to 30? Yeah, see most of you, right? Thank you. And these are the words that you guys have all heard. Young, affluent, they have strong spending power. Great. Now, I mentioned earlier that the gap is changing generationally, that I don't personally believe that it's any more about how old I am or, where I live. The world's very flat when it comes to data. It doesn't matter where you live, you can get the same story I get here. And I tell my classes this all the time. How fast can you get a package from Europe or even Asia into the United States? It may be more difficult in South America, but like a day. Anybody can buy anything and have it the next day, which means that trend becomes flat, not from a mediocre perspective, but more the fact that everyone can get anything at the same time. Kids in Dubai are wearing the same clothes that kids in New York are wearing. Now, things have changed a little bit. The personal shopping consumer on Essence is now 18 to 50. Notice that got wide. That went from 21 to 30 to a younger consumer plus a 20-year jump, right? Again, telling us that it's younger and older. Now, how you describe that, I don't know. But let's get more into it a little bit. I asked Hayne, okay, what's selling on Essence? And by the way, for those that don't know, Essence carries essentially all of the big designers, as well as small brands, as well as some of the more mass brands like Stella and Max Mara, etc. Anybody from Stella or Max Mara in the room? Okay, good, because it's not going to get nice for them later. And the way that she talked about it was that there's kind of like this great divide with their consumer. On one hand, you have the extreme anything is possible consumer that's buying a specific style of fashion. I guess extreme fashion would be the name of it. These are the people that are buying Rick Owens, that are buying Anne de Meulemeester, anything that's coming out of Belgium, extreme fashion. And what's interesting is that the extreme fashion audience is still strong and loud, meaning they're still buying. So that market is not being touched by whatever's happening. It is a core unified POV. That's very important to think about. Listen, I love Rick. I can't wear half of it. But guess what? The consumer that can breathes, loves it, absorbs it. So on one side of the coin, you have extreme fashion still working. You make crazy stuff, stuff that connects, you're just going to sell. On the other side, new designers are selling. And this is the big change that they're seeing at the brand. More than ever, brands, and she said this very specifically, brands with different upbringings are selling. Brands that look like us. More than ever, consumers are connecting with brands that look like themselves. This is the connection that a brand should always have with their consumer. And at the same time, there's this aspirational aspect. And I asked her to explain that. She said, listen, when you look at young designers like Sandy Lang or whoever's coming up, more than ever, there is a young creative class that is looking at those designers saying, I can do the same thing. So more than ever, there's an aspirational touch that's coming from it. Okay, so if I talked about the extreme of Rick and Vivienne Westwood, and then on the other side you have smaller brands, they're seeing less of this. The uniform is starting to slow down. I wear a uniform all day. I'm never going to stop wearing a uniform. My students know me, I literally wear black or white and maybe some jeans. Never going to change. But more than ever, consumers want less conformity. They want less unison. And this actually plays in a lot to maybe what happened before COVID, right? Or rather, during COVID, we all kind of got, at least in the United States, we all bought sweatpants. Who didn't buy sweatpants? Who did not buy sweatpants during COVID? Come on, I don't believe you. I mean, everybody bought sweatpants. So we're seeing less of the uniform. Again, this is anecdotal, right? And this one really got me. The Goop moms are gone. Does anybody know what this means? Who's familiar with Goop? Anybody work for Goop in the room? Okay, good. So Goop is Gwyneth Paltrow. Everyone know Gwyneth Paltrow? Gwyneth Paltrow's actually an incredible brand. Full disclosure, my company had the same investors as Goop as well. So we were all part of the same crew. But what Goop Moms means, it was a consumer that was spending a lot of time looking at content and buying some strange things, quite frankly, that Goop was selling. But Goop also has an incredible supplement line. You're seeing a little bit of a movement away from that. Again, there's nothing wrong with Goop. There's nothing wrong with Goop Moms, but the trend is that they want something else. Again, generational gap is gone. It's about mindset. And I've been preaching this for 20 years. It is not about what color you are, where you're from. It's about how we think. There is a relation. There is a reason why certain cultures cross paths. If you look at high fashion and luxury, the majority of men's design, not men's fashion designers, but the men's designers in the space, they all came out of skateboarding and punk rock. There is no generational gap. And I think that's all I have for now. And I want to now take it open for questions or comments, because I think this gets important. One other note I want to make, too, about the Essence info that I have, as well as the other info, is that more than ever, the more data we have, the better we can make decisions. But the truth is that when you're working on your project, you have to be focused on what you know and not necessarily let these variables play out. The other point I want to make, too, was about building a new cohort. Do not sleep on the fact that all of your consumers are coming from Puerto Rico or Dominican Republic. It is great to sell your product all day. Remember, when that gentleman was talking on stage, he was talking about a specific sales channel. Do not sleep on trying to reach your other consumers. Just because everybody in Puerto Rico and Dominican is buying your product does not mean that other consumers don't exist. Any questions on what we've discussed? Go ahead.
You mentioned that sustainability is declining in terms of what consumers are interested in. Why do you think that's happening?
That's funny. So that just came out today, and I'm like quite shocked about it because it actually plays against the data points here where they're not really registering right now. And I don't know if it's a fatigue, but at the end of the day, I still believe that we will come to a place where if you're not doing the right thing, you're likely not going to have a consumer. You know, like you just have to. Go ahead. Yeah, I mean, I guess that's the greatest data point showing us why sustainability doesn't matter. You know, I think there's a consumer that's attracted to consumption. People like to shop. They just want to put a lot of stuff. And I think other consumers, and again, this is all anecdotal, there's other consumers that cannot believe that they can buy a jacket for $2, right? But I promise you, if somebody's buying a jacket for $2, somebody's getting hurt along the way. There's just no way somebody is not being exploited, if I can put it safely. I mean, quite frankly, $20 jeans, even at $20 jeans, somebody is getting hurt. So the other side of it is that it's fast. And what may not be apparent is that, and I keep hearing this a lot, Temu is just targeting hard on the platforms like Meta, right? But the other thing that they're doing is they're starting to cause supply chain issues with shipping. I've been told that Temu and Shein are actually pre-purchasing freight and shipping for the next 24 months because they literally they want to just control how much product is flowing in and out. We're going to start, I guarantee the United States will start putting their foot down around that. What does that mean? That means that you can't get your product on a boat because they're literally buying so much of the freight inventory today. I never thought you could get, I just never thought you could get, I want to say this very kindly, I just never thought we would get that cheap. Does that make sense? Like it doesn't make sense. So, but at the same time, listen, consumers love dupes. Everyone's familiar with the idea of a dupe. It's a very common thing in the United States. I'm sure it's very common in Latin America as well. But the idea is that there's a consumer that doesn't necessarily care if something's real or not. And, you know, the hope is that that changes as well. Any other questions? Hi. You're a small brand? Do you have budget? I love WGSN. I use it for my job. It's part of one of the tools that we use here at the school. All of our students have access to it. And it gives you an idea, it gives you a good perspective of what the next 24 months will look like, or it'll give you a good output. They are, of course, partnered with Coloro, which is one of four major, um, what's the word, color tracks, basically, Pantone, them, and a few others. So I think there's a lot of value in that. But if you're looking for trend data, there's a lot of free tools out there from Google to Facebook. And I mean, I think the real secret sauce is using the Facebook ad manager to pull data. You'd be surprised at how much free data there is around. I would not necessarily, again, I love the product, but I would not necessarily invest into that if I was trying to get a better understanding of where my consumer is. Go ahead. It's not free, but I think the State of Fashion report from Business of Fashion is not necessarily free, but they have very strong top-level headlines. There actually is not that many sources of news for new brands today. It's kind of all over the place, a bit disparate on social media. And there are small targets that are, bloggers, as they say, that are still producing good curated lists. I hope that answers that question. I guess the internet, and you'd be surprised at how much free stuff there is. Google Trends is one of my favorite tools. Hello. I don't know. I do. I mean, I'm 49, and I don't know. I still go to space. Like so, like it's not like life doesn't slow down anymore the older you get. You know what I mean? Look at a yearbook from 10 years ago, and like an 18-year-old looked like he was 40. You know, so we are all taking care of ourselves. We are healthier. We're much more aware. I mean, we should be living better lives. With that in mind, yeah, I don't think necessarily that the age gap will change. And the one thing that the report did pull, and I did mention around new cohorts, is that the report, and again, you guys, the report will be fully published November 13th, but the one point they made was like, you have to start looking at new markets. You need to start looking at where your consumer is, and, you know, yeah, you got to put in the work, and I hope that answers it. One more question? Hi. Yeah, sure. So I co-founded a brand called Highsnobiety about, we started in 2005, so I came on in 2006. And for those that are not familiar with that time, wait, how many people were born pre-2000? Or after 2000, rather? Okay, good. So in 2005, if folks remember, LiveJournal and blogging was really popular. And who remembers Tumblr? Tumblr was still big, and actually, quite funny enough, is still big. So the idea was that we understood that social media and instant access to news was important. We knew that we were not finding any of that storytelling anywhere. So the bet was that that consumer between luxury and mainstream, which was us, and a really simple way of thinking about it, there was always this like idea that skateboarders never wore luxury, and at the end of the day, it's actually pretty untrue. Like, luxury is pretty accessible to everyone. So we were the first to talk about like Nike sneakers and, Goyard as an example, which none of these guys had any websites at the time. We just kind of pushed. We just pushed a POV that we thought was ours, which was very male-centric in the beginning. Today, it is not male-centric. In fact, it is much wider. I would not call it unisex. I would call it men, women, and everything in between. And that's one of the best things that I love about what we do. But it was, I mean, just like I said on social media, like you have to remember, we were posting like 40 stories a day at one point, right? So we were just going. But that game is gone. It's a lot better, I think, to write good content that you can then get shared. And the other way to share it is to work with other creators. Maybe you're working with influencer or a model, and making sure that they also reciprocate on what kind of tagging you do. You got to put in the work. I think I've said it like 3 times, but yeah, working sucks, but you got to do it. Anyone else? I think that's the last question. Thank you so much, guys. Thanks for coming to Maragoni.